Despite being the 6th largest country in the world, Australia is mostly uninhabited. With most Australians living in city centres like Melbourne and Sydney, it leaves 95% of the land completely empty. Why is that? The population density of Australia is only 3.3 people per square kilometre, which is drastically low in comparison to most countries. For comparison, India and the United States have population densities of 464 and 36 people per square kilometre respectively. But that doesn't mean that the urban areas aren't jam-packed with people. Melbourne's inner city has a whopping population density of 22,400 people per square kilometre, which is a drastic difference from the rest of the country. 90% of the entire country's population is confined into these small urban regions, with 80% of Australians living less than 50 kilometres away from the coastline. Why exactly is Australia's population so compactly shoved inside these big cities? Well, there are a few reasons. The main one being the fact that the terrain and weather of most of Australia's land does not provide enough safety for a basic standard of living. Most of Australia's terrain is outback, or desert as we commonly call it, which makes for highly inadequate living conditions. The harsh, hot climate of the desert makes anywhere away from the water completely uninhabitable, with temperatures frequently going well over 40 degrees Celsius or 104 degrees Fahrenheit. It's simply impossible, or at least very uncomfortable, for a person to survive in those conditions. Harsh, dry climates also make it difficult for agriculture and livestock to thrive, making these desert regions scarce of necessary natural resources that are required for forming a thriving community. Desert areas often experience periods of sustained drought, only allowing for crops like tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, melons, and cucumbers to thrive in the hot climate. Any other sort of farming is relatively unsustainable without a ready supply of water and healthy soil. With global warming worsening, Australia has become even more vulnerable to increased temperatures. The Australian interior is highly prone to bushfires, which makes it increasingly difficult to create homes in this area. Although the warmer temperatures have brought Australia much more precipitation than normal, this still hasn't solved the issues of the droughts, but rather have brought forth even more problems due to excessive rain and a massive increase in flooding of residential areas. Brisbane, in particular, had a year's worth of rain in 5 days in February of 2021, and suffered from $656 million Australian dollars in damages as a result. These floods have not only ruined property, over 28,000 houses to be exact, but also claimed the lives of at least 27 people. Back in April of 2023, every Australian resident was on edge from the anticipation of a terrifying Category 5 cyclone called Isla that was expected to hit. The wind gusts were predicted to go up to 315 kilometers an hour, making Isla the strongest cyclone to ever threaten Australia in over 12 years. With such a stark contrast in the coastline and the inland environments, Australia is exposed to a plethora of weather incidents. These sudden temperature fluctuations and unexpected weather events are expected to continue happening and to increase in frequency. As the climate crisis gets more severe, and with July of 2023 being on track to be the hottest month ever recorded, there's no telling the extent of damage that will be done to not just the outback and its minimal flora and fauna, but also residential communities all throughout Australia. According to the Climate Council, about 1 in 25 Australian homes could be rendered uninsurable due to excessive flood risks by as early as 2030. Should that happen, Australia may need to adapt and find a way to move some of its residents to that 95% of uninhabited land. With the extreme heat also comes complications with water, with much of Australia having a lack of water due to dry weather conditions. In 2022, the annual mean rainfall was just 587.8 millimeters. The country, on average, receives less than 500 millimeters of rain per year, which is concerningly low. In 2019, Australia saw the lowest value of rainfall recorded in years, and that's only expected to get worse considering global warming. The country's main source of water is the Murray-Darling Basin, a river that runs from southern Queensland through the border of New South Wales and Victoria, ending at the southeast of Adelaide. 40% of the country's total agricultural produce comes from the basin, which includes 100% of their rice, 75% of their grapes, and 30% of dairy. The problem with being so highly dependent on one source of water is that should a drought dry it up, there are few backup plans. The Australian government has long since identified droughts at the Murray-Darling Basin to be a high priority problem, as water resources were severely reduced during the years of 2001 to 2009. The lowest reported inflows were during this time frame, which caused salinity levels to increase sixfold. Each year, the Murray-Darling Basin only brings in around 24,000 gigalitres of water, which is the lowest flow rate of river systems around the world. Currently, the basin has a volume that is lower than the average, at around 20,766 gigalitres. If you don't count the dead storage amount, only 20,083 gigalitres of that water is accessible for use. For reference, the United States has an annual flow rate of around 503,000 gigalitres. With much of the country's agriculture being dependent on this particular river system, the climate crisis makes this situation much more dire, as increased temperatures will undoubtedly only result in less rainfall, which is already a severe problem. Horror stories are frequently told about Australia's terrifying array of wild animals. The remote inlands of the Australian outback are the ideal home for Australia's diverse collection of wildlife, which range from harmless to downright deadly. The threat of dangerous wildlife is very real for Australians, with spiders, snakes, and other poisonous insects being a main deterrent of residing in outback regions. There are over 66 venomous species of snake that reside in Australia, and even the smallest of bites would contain enough venom to kill you, or at least seriously injure you. Although the number of animal attacks may be exaggerated, the serious risk that is accompanied with even a slim chance encounter with an Australian animal is what scares people the most. Almost all snakes in Australia are venomous, and that's because they fall under the category of elapids, which is the most toxic group of species. Snakes aside, Australia also houses dangerous species like the Sydney funnel-web spider, which can kill a child in less than 15 minutes. There are also lethal birds that can be found all around the Australian outback. Even though they may not sound as scary, they are not to be underestimated, as they are highly aggressive and have razor-sharp daggers that can easily break through human skin and flesh. That being said, even though a bulk of Australia's terrain is the rough outback and filled with dangerous wildlife, there is still around 6% of land that could be usable for farming, and a reserve of around 492 cubic kilometres of fresh water available for use. If you take in the sheer size of Australia as perspective, 6% of land is a significant amount and could undoubtedly propel the Australian agriculture industry forward, allowing for a higher population density and more living communities to thrive. However, new infrastructure is difficult to build. With Australia having been accustomed to dense, metropolitan areas for so long, straying from its norm would require significant research and development, extensive city planning, and heavy investment. For many Australians, there isn't any point in moving away from the city, especially when the country isn't making any effort into establishing different living regions. Not to mention, the dauntingly high temperatures are likely reason enough for most people to stay near the water. With a majority of the population residing within the urban areas, there is simply nothing incentivizing Australians to move away to remote areas that have a scarcity of resources, opportunity, and people. Most of the coveted employment opportunities, recreational activities, and attractions are all within minutes of the coastline, and removing yourself from that environment seems to be a counterproductive decision. Unless the Australian government carries out a large-scale plan to create more sustainable and appealing housing outside of the main cities, it's likely that most of the Australian land will remain uninhabited. If you like learning about Australia and its unique, but mostly empty land, you might be interested in learning about its economy. Take a look at this video to find out how, despite its low population density, Australia's economy remains highly prosperous.